All right. It's 6 o'clock right now, so we are going to start conservation conversations tonight. Thank you everybody for coming out. We're really excited about this discussion tonight. My name is Bridget Sanderson, by the way. I am the Director of Environment Missouri, based out of Kansas City. We work to protect our clean air, clean water, and our public spaces. I'm really excited about conservation conversations tonight. It's going to be a really interesting conversation. We started this actually as we were all stuck at home. Kate and I wanted to, open up conversation and kind of start, bringing people together to, kind of look at nature in a different way or learn something new. And so this is kind of how we decided to do it, was with conservation conversations. So sorry. So I'm really excited about tonight. I will go ahead and let Kate take the reins.
Awesome. Thank you, Bridget. So I'm Kate. I am the advocate with Environment Maryland. And as Bridget said, this series has highlighted some different conservation and nature issues, and tonight is going to be great. Our guest is going to be talking about green stormwater infrastructure. I'm going to read his bio, and I don't know where everyone is in the country, but I know there have been storms kind of all over today. And so I feel like this is such a timely topic as storms get more severe and less predictable. I think that this topic is going to become just so incredibly important. So Chris Cardwell is our guest. He is a native plant professional raised in central Kansas. He began a career in contracting in 2008 with Applied Ecological Services, and then went on to launch his own native landscaping company, Green Hand, in 2013. Since 2018, Chris has served as a program manager for Bridging the Gap, one of Kansas City's premier environmental nonprofits. Currently under contract with Kansas City Water, Chris's team of technicians is responsible for the maintenance of over 300 green stormwater infrastructure sites across the Kansas City metro area. And he also helps to administer a residential cost share reimbursement program for Johnson County, Kansas stormwater. You can learn more about Bridging the Gap on their website or their social media if you go to our social media, and we link to them, so be sure to check them out. So Chris, thank you so much for being here, and I am going to turn it over to you.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much, all of our Environment America partners, for inviting me to share some of the work that Bridging the Gap is doing here in Kansas City. As Kate mentioned, we are across the board a very solid, one of the premier environmental groups here in Kansas City as far as action on the ground. Our programming is really varied, from planting trees for parks and for right-of-ways in residential areas. We operate the recycling centers for KC Most Solid Waste. We maintain wild spaces, and we base a lot of our work before this epidemic on volunteer labor. So we're adapting as well with a lot of our programming. Fortunately, because of our essential nature being in water infrastructure, our program has been able to continue unaltered throughout the whole crisis. So without further ado, I'm really excited. As you mentioned, anybody in the upper Midwest or Ohio River Valley area over the last 2 days who's going to have a very fresh frame of reference for what we'll discuss today, which is stormwater management from my angle, from an environmental management and sustainable practices standpoint, and also from a municipal standpoint too. So I'm going to share my PowerPoint with you and talk as we go through. If you've got questions, just upload them to the other hosts, type them in, and we'll save time at the end. So let's get this PowerPoint here, I hope. I think that worked out great. Excellent. So again, my name's Chris, and this is about green stormwater infrastructure. I think I can get it to work. There we go. To talk about any of these stories, we really always have to go back to the beginning. This is the beginning of human habitation of this continent, roughly. This is maybe one of the original Google Earth images from, say, 17 to 20,000 years ago of what North America might have looked like at this time. So the last of the most recent ice ages descended on North America. The seas have receded, and our continent may or may not have looked something like this, with these ice-covered regions descending all the way down into the upper Midwest of the United States. What happened when that ice age began to recede was that it left behind it in its geological wake what topography and soils and layout of the land would be the foundation for what would become the primary watersheds of our entire continent. So at number one there, you see, of course, the Great Lakes, possibly the largest repository of fresh water, at least within reach of Kansas City for sure, but definitely the largest in North America. We have number two, our home watershed, the Missouri River watershed, starting up in the headwaters up in the Rocky Mountains in Montana, and descending all the way down here, joining the Mississippi River Valley, technically at St. Louis, where it becomes part of what is collectively the largest watershed on the continent, which includes then number four, the Ohio River Valley, of course. So basically everything from the eastern Rocky Mountains to the Smoky, the Blue Ridge and the eastern seaboard of the Atlantic coast, that entire basin is considered as one giant watershed, completely full of smaller and not so small, but then even smaller sub-watersheds within it. And this is about the time when human civilization arrives, at least in the Midwest. You know, we can date the first arrivals back roughly 13,000, 15,000 years ago, as the ecosystem began to develop with the retreat of the glaciers. This is just a basic image of what a watershed is. I know that we're all kind of maybe in different areas of expertise, but watershed can be simply put as an entire area bordered by a drainage boundary. So the whole area of which will all drain into one single outflow. This can be as complicated as, say, like the mountain valley in which a number of cities live that outflow to some upper headwaters of the Colorado River. Or this could be as simply put in an example as your bathtub and the one drain that comes out of it. But basically, a watershed incorporates a great range of places and topographies and habited and uninhabited spaces that all merge together their stormwater and their outflow. It all blends together. So whether you live at the top of the mountain or not, all of our water ends up into the greater watershed, which is, again, the drinking water supply for a great bulk of our population here in the country. The way that things worked before settlers arrived in this part of the country was essentially that we had a vast grassland. It was maintained by native populations loosely with some prescribed fire, rotational grazing in air quotes with pursuit of nomadic herds and such. But basically, from top left, you'll see that's what kind of equation we could expect with a natural ground cover. So let's say the original prairie that was here in the upper Midwest, if a rain event would occur, about 25% of that could be expected to infiltrate deep into the bedrock to go back in to recharge groundwater. About 25% of it will stay in the upper soils. That'll be uptaken by plants. 10% of it, that's a big number. To some prairie estimates are as low as 1 to 3% of stormwater will actually run off, whereas 40% of it is evapotranspired, meaning that's plants breathing it back out into the atmosphere, taking it down from rainwater, taking it up into their roots, breathing it back out. So top right, you'll see, all right, maybe European settlers start to arrive. We start to build some permanent settlements. We start to build some throughways. We've got some industrial sites and such. And about 10 to 20% of the surface of our habitable places become impervious, which means we block them off. An impervious surface is one that won't let water infiltrate into it. It doesn't absorb water. Water hits it, just as in the roof of this little cabin here, and water runs off. It goes away and immediately begins a fast track towards the nearest outflow possibility. So you see immediately in the top right, shallow infiltration and deep infiltration both reduced, and evapotranspiration reduced ever so slightly, but runoff doubles. And this is, we understand a little bit more now, it's a big talk about exponential. But as we come into the bottom left site here, you're going to see that about 30 to 50% of impervious surface changes the game substantially. You can expect that maybe that would be, late 19th century, early 20th century America. We start to pave our roads, we start to build highways, and we begin the age of the automobile possibly early on. And runoff from stormwater events is now 1/3. 1/3 of the water that hits our cities, our towns, our communities runs off immediately and has to be managed. No longer is managed by the ground. And only now 15% of it is actually going to ever end up back in the groundwater, which is where a lot of our drinking water was sourced from at that time, of course, well water. And then we come into the bottom right, into the modern era. We've got cities, we've got metropolitan areas, we've got highways crisscrossing the entire country. It's likely that 75 to 100% of our urban areas are impervious at this point in our country, meaning that this is a loose diagram, of course, but about 55% of the water that falls on our cities ends up as runoff. Anybody in the upper Midwest today, specifically anybody in the Kansas City area, who is trying to drive through those 1.5 foot deep puddles that were in places where there used to be a street, like this morning, they understand that 55% of the rain that just fell isn't going anywhere. It's staying here. It's running off. There are a lot of impervious surfaces. So this is not only a challenge both from an environmental standpoint, because all that runoff carries with it every pollutant that it touches. Water is, of course, very conducive to carrying things with it, not just physical objects, litter, fertilizer materials as well from lawns, pollution from the roads, the oils and the antifreeze and such leaks out of our automobiles, the road salts and winter rain events. It just takes everything with it. And that 55% of the rain that falls on that urban area now, which has such a high impervious surface rate, it's a toxic material. Wastewater has to be treated, of course, because it's originally toxic. But now stormwater comes up in the same way. It becomes as necessary to be treated, or at least mitigated as is possible. So this is, again, just a loose graphic. The science behind it is far beyond anything that I'm smart enough to explain. We'll get to that in a deeper conversation later on, I'm sure. This is the root system of what was that original natural ground cover. So at the top left, you saw natural ground cover, what things were like in this utopian, when we first arrived here. And we all know that, of course, that's never going to go back to where it was. Once the prairie hit the plow, when the European settlers arrived, we realized what this root system over the course of tens of thousands of years had done was it had created the most rich topsoil on this continent. This diagram, loose and rough to see, this is from Heidi Natura in Chicago at the time, was with Living Habitats, a beautiful environmental architectural firm. And this is a hand-drawn graphic, largely, that demonstrates the depth of root systems of native upper Midwestern plants. And I'm sure that there can be an equivalent all across the country, wherever you are today in you're joining us with this talk. And we see some beautiful root systems that descend as far as 14, 15 feet, but on average, at least 7, 8 feet of dense root system. Now, what that does is, not only does that benefit the plants, of course, because they're drought tolerant and they've got strong roots and they're going to be steady throughout changes in season and climate, drought tolerant and flood tolerant as well. But that root system that is so deep not only sequesters carbon in the ground itself just by being a carbon entity underneath the ground, but it also created over those millennia the topsoil that settlers found when they first arrived here. And you put the plow to the prairie and you realize, wow, we've got 12 feet of rich 10,000-year-old topsoil. We can feed America. That's how we became the breadbasket, was because of being this prairie ecosystem. And if you have your glasses on, you can look over at the far left of this diagram and you'll see a tiny little black square rectangle there. You scroll down and you'll see that happens to be the root system of what is classically Kentucky bluegrass. One of the makeup species of a variety of grasses that we actually use predominantly in our lawns. American lawns at this point, old numbers from 2005 would show that there's roughly 40 million acres of tiny, rooted American lawn across our country. Enough lawn to cover the state of New York, enough lawn to require about 2.4 million metric tons of synthetic fertilizer to maintain it each year, and enough lawn to require enough irrigation to be watered each year to fill the Chesapeake Bay at least once, if not twice in a year of drought, if you take into account the entire country. The root systems of those grasses that dominate the American landscape are, in fact, so shallow that their infiltration rates are virtually zero, meaning that any surface runoff that comes from our lawns carries with it those 2.4 million metric tons of fertilizer that we've applied to it, along with the herbicide, the mosquito joe, the grub killer, and so on. But turfgrass is the most prolific irrigated crop in the United States, far beyond corn for irrigation. Of course, corn is king, but we water more grass in this country than any other plant that is in our horticultural system. So this is a foundation. We'll come back to this graphic maybe a little bit conceptually in just a minute. Here's an actual sort of three-dimensional version of it that was on display in DC in the US Botanical Garden Museum. So you see, maybe a little blurry, apologize, it was a small image, but this is a bulk mass of root systems. They don't lay neatly side by side as would, say, a drawing, but they're an interwoven 7 to 12 to 15 foot deep virtual sponge, a vegetative sponge that absorbs so much stormwater that I like to paraphrase statistics. Is that a thing? Can you paraphrase the statistic? But the anecdote is that an acre of prairie can take an inch of rain and absorb about 90% to 99% of it, whereas an acre of a Walmart parking lot will take an inch of rain, receive it, and outflow 36,000 gallons of runoff, taking with it all of the wrappers, the cigarette butts, the pollutants from your car, and they all go into the storm drain. In Kansas City, and probably across a lot of the cities that we're going to be talking to today, we have an old infrastructure system. This is gray infrastructure. This is the stuff that was built into the ground long time ago. On the left, you have a combined sewer system, which is what happened in this area, in the large part of Kansas City, Missouri at least, was that we dug pipes in the ground into which we put our sanitary sewer. If you look on the left, this is the brown from our houses, and the equivalent brown from our businesses, whether that be chemicals from manufacturing, whether that be just our day-to-day household wastes, whatever, they go into a sewer system, what we understand as sewer. However, if you look into the blue lines there, you're going to see that street storm drains also come into this same system. We only dug one trench and we only built one pipe, and we put everything into it. And of course, as progress develops, the impervious surface of our cities has expanded exponentially. We have thousands more houses and buildings and parking lots than we did when we put these systems in the ground in the early 20th century. And we are taking massive hits in infrastructure replacement costs. We know that this is a big deal. So what happens is, on the left, that's dry. That's how it works normally. Everything comes in the sanitary system and it goes to the treatment facility. It's mitigated and it still goes out into the public waterway. However, like you were mentioning with these unpredictable rainfall events, these kind of changing patterns in the way that we can predict and understand what to expect. I think today we had, a really substantial rain event throughout the day. I haven't looked at Stormwater data today, but I would bet that there was a couple inches easily in a day throughout the area. And when that falls on, say, western Kansas, no big deal. There's lots of green, there's lots of open, pervious surface to absorb that rainwater. However, when that amount of rain falls on an urban area like Kansas City, that volume of water goes into the same system that's now absorbing a population that has increased tenfold, hundredfold, who knows, from when those systems were first designed. So already we're putting a burden on our infrastructure systems based on the fact that we now have commercial dishwashers. We operate an entire industry of laundering. We have God knows how many times more homes and businesses and such. They're all contributing to the actual same system that has been built so long ago. So it's already burdened. And then we add this cataclysmic, unpredictable 100-year storm that can come through. A couple years ago, we got 4 inches in an hour. And even if anybody's down in Houston, I was at a water conference in Austin last September, and a gentle, otherwise harmless tropical storm decided to just park over Houston and dump nearly 3 feet of rain in a day. There's no way that any of their infrastructure was prepared for that. And this is what happens, is that in Kansas City specifically, the combined system fills up, and this mixture of stormwater and sanitary sewer waste is outfelled into the nearest public waterway. Sometimes the pipe gets so full that it says, no, you can't go that way, and you have to go back the way you came. And it'll end up overflowing manholes, as it did today in Kansas City. A really nice light brown frothy mixture blowing manholes open and perhaps emerging in basements. Ideally, you've already cooked your laundry up off the floor when that'll happen, but this is a huge problem. The EPA stepped in some time ago, at least in Kansas City. I know there are many cities around the country where this became an issue. We're under consent decree to fix it. We realize that digging up every pipe is not going to solve the problem. Here's an example of what a combined sewer overflow looks like in the top. You just saw that. But even if you separate the sewers and you do the sanitary sewer in one and it can all go to the sewer treatment plant, that's awesome. But your separate storm sewer for storm drains only has to outfall straight to the river, meaning it takes with it all the litter from the street, all the road salt, all the chemicals from the auto traffic. Everything that can come off of the storm drain is going to go straight to the river. And a lot of places have separate storm systems, which is good. It's a relief of a burden from the wastewater system infrastructure. But you'll see those little markers on each storm drain that says, please don't put anything in here because it goes right into our river. Unfortunately, we're not able to control the way that stormwater flows from the streets, and it takes with it a lot of pollutants. We say, in the early days when we were building these infrastructures, we were saying it's a downstream problem, not a big deal. The gray infrastructure model at the top of the page, the goal was conveyance. Get it out of here as quickly as possible. I don't care where it goes. Get it into the river, get it off our streets. We got to get it's raining, it can't ruin things. Whereas a green infrastructure model thinks a little bit more deeply about how to solve that, how to trace the trickle back to its source and say, we need to treat this where it falls. If in the original context of, say, the prairie ecosystem, the rain would stay where it fell, at least, a large majority of it, we wouldn't have so many issues and it wouldn't be a downstream problem, because the reality of our environment is that unless you're standing at the top of the mountain, everywhere is downstream from somewhere. So we make jokes about Kansas City water being Omaha P about 8 days ago, but this is loosely the truth, or the way that things work. Green infrastructure works to treat, at the very least, to slow the water and to capture it in place if possible through 5 different ways. We want to infiltrate, meaning we take that storm water, we'll hold it in place and it'll trickle back into the groundwater. We want to evapotranspire, which is plants breathing. They drink the water up, they put it out through their leaves, it goes back into the atmosphere. Water cycle starts over. At the very least, green infrastructure filters. We're going to see some sites that we maintain here in Kansas City where number one thing that is an obvious benefit is that we are catching litter at the site before it ends up in the storm drain. Big bulky litter is a huge burden in wastewater treatment facilities. You can Google "don't flush your wipes" videos, and you can see that physical litter is such a burden that it even takes over, say, the chemical treatment to reduce bacteria and bring water back down to drinkable quality. We can store that water. We can hold it in place. We can create underground storage and so on. Or at very least, when we do store that water as surface water, it evaporates. Sun hits it. It does our job for us. It's not a downstream problem anymore. The goal of green infrastructure is always to mimic the natural hydrologic cycle. We're never going to go back to the prairie. There's 4% of the original grasslands left in the upper Midwest, in the whole Midwest, in the whole continent. About 4% of what was originally here that was prairie ecosystem remains. A lot of people working very hard to maintain and preserve that, especially here in Missouri. But our idea about engineering solutions to stormwater management is to try to mimic that, see how we can take the best of those systems and actually design and engineer it. So you'll see this again, that beautiful colored model. The goal would be that 40 to 50% of all the water that ever falls gets drank up by plants and keeps plants vibrant and goes back up into the air. And then we're left with less than half of it to deal with. Less than one of it runs off. 20% of it goes in the ground. We drink up about 40% of it because it gets into the groundwater. This is, of course, very idealistic model, but these are numbers that we want to try to replicate on a very micro scale as it engineered processes. This is what green infrastructure looks like in Kansas City today. At the top of this, I took this photograph yesterday. At the top of the photograph, you see the inflow of the curb. They're coming into what is a pretreatment facility. The storm drain is protected by this facility. So all the water that's coming into it from downstream, or from rather upstream from the street, goes through this entire system of plants, scour reduction systems, cobbles, and storage facilities before it goes into that storm drain there in the center. Now the storm drain has to take immediate runoff from the street, of course, otherwise the street will flood and it can overwhelm our gardens. But we're doing a really great deal of work just with something as simple as this. Now this is a complete streets model as well. So this was in conjunction with, say, sidewalk replacements. This is in an urban area, urban thoroughfare on Troost here in 30th. But it becomes not just a stormwater system. This isn't just a big concrete box of gray infrastructure. This is a garden. We haven't yet seen lilies bloom, but this is going to be yellow and orange and gold and purple here in a couple weeks. It's a beautiful addition to this urban landscape of what would otherwise be a gray and polluted system. So large volumes of water empty into this at every rain event, and you're going to see some examples of that here in the future. Further up the street from there is this one, which doesn't actually empty into a storm drain. This is more of an engaged pedestrian planting. So you see the sidewalk and a crosswalk here to go to the apartments across the street. This is the Kansas City, Missouri Health Department. The water will come into these sites, and there's our first daylily bloom in that one, little gold Stella d'Oro. But again, the cobbles, there's something called the Manning coefficient, so scour. Even just running that stormwater over those rocks slows it down to where it becomes more manageable by the storm system. These green infrastructure facilities have multiple benefits that are all engineered and designed. It's forward thinking, and it's trying to replicate a natural process. Here, a little further up, the same spot right there, this is the view from the sidewalk itself. You see that there's actual curb cuts in the concrete that allow not just the flow from the road and not just the flow from upslope through the gutter and through these systems, but also the flow from the sidewalk that goes directly into the facility there as well. And take note of that semi-constructed apartment building in yellow insulation up at the top there. We're going to see what kind of impacts development has on green infrastructure. Beneath the ground, this is what one of these might look like. This is one of many types of designs you can see. This is bioretention. Bioretention just means we're going to hold water in this little spot, and it's going to have plants in it, and it's going to have engineered soils, and those soils are going to absorb water like sponges to mimic the root systems of prairie ecosystems or native deep root systems. Sometimes those plants planted in there are native root systems, and they will grow in and fill in and become this giant urban sponge. At the right, you'll see an underdrain or an overflow structure. So that'll be like a riser basket. So when this thing fills up to the point where maybe it's going to start flooding in the street, then we can start letting water into the storm system. And when the water filters out all the hydrocarbons and all the litter and all the pollution and gets to the bottom, it'll go into an underdrain and slowly trickle into the stormwater system, where it can be, again, hopefully managed and treated at the water treatment facility, or if not, at the very least, slowly released to avoid peak flow and combined sewer overflow events. Here's an example of one of those overflow structures. This is another set of sites on 20th Street here in our Arts District. This is set up with a weir dam. So the first flush of water is going to come in, and if it overflows this particular structure, it'll then start going into the next there with the Sweet Spire, which has another overflow structure and another overflow structure after that. So really sort of setting these thresholds to where, all right, we can take on this much rainwater immediately, and we can then stagger it and layer out the burden of this stormwater management over the course of several facilities, several dozen facilities if necessary. This is the actual site in which that previous picture sits. Again, with this engaged landscape. This is a complete streets model here as well. You see the bike lane in the road. You see a multimodal path, large wide sidewalk there, as well as pedestrian engagement for the automobile parking. These are living landscapes. They're beautiful. They welcome people in, as well as demonstrate to anybody who's paying attention during a rainstorm that we're managing our stormwater with something green and something beautiful. Here's the look from the other end, the backside of that weir dam. You're seeing Grand Boulevard and 20th Street in downtown KC-Mo there. And you're looking at vibrant, healthy trees, grasses. Now, granted, they get watered a lot. So some of the less drought-tolerant species kind of wean themselves out. And these are fairly new. You know, this is a construction probably from less than 10 years ago. We're still learning here. I know that the project we'll talk about soon in just a minute is about a 5 to 7 year long project. We're figuring out what works best and what doesn't work best. Typically native plants work best just because they're drought tolerant and flood tolerant. And we have both. So here's the follow-up. You see that picture on the right with that yellow apartment complex. These are on opposite sides of the same street. These are the same facilities after the same rain event last Tuesday. You see on the left a chocolate milkshake of muck and mud, and if you want to dig in that water, you go right ahead because it's full of all kinds of nasty. The outflow volume that entered this site as opposed to its neighbor across the street is dramatic. It's evident. The picture's worth 1,000 words. You can see both the quality of stormwater and the quantity of stormwater from that side of the street is heavily impacted by pending development and irresponsible erosion control management from the contractors on site at that soon-to-be luxury apartment complex. So while this was a brilliant Green Streets model, putting in the green infrastructure first before the development plan or the master plan has flushed itself out altogether is something that needs to be worked out. We need to work on the balance between that. I'm extremely grateful that this stormwater doesn't go directly into the storm drain with all of the pollution from that construction site. But I'm also concerned because we're going to have to rebuild this green infrastructure site. This BMP is toast after a couple years of this treatment. It's hard on the plants, it's too much water, and the soils become compacted by the water volume and mismanagement through some other various challenges. What happens though, here's what it looks like going in. It's like the muddy Amazon or something. These these pre-treatment facilities up in the front here are little concrete barriers. Not only does that sort of confuse the water and tell it, okay, well, maybe I'm going this way, maybe I'm going that way. It slows it all down. It also helps to reduce the turbidity of that water. So the sediment will hit the wall there of those little blocks and it'll be trapped, at least some of it. Suspended solids continue into the storm drain to be required to be treated or to just end up in the overflow. And what happens at the end of that rain event is this. Part of our maintenance job is after every major rain event to come through and scrape the mud that has flown off of, say, for example, that construction site, or the sand that has flowed off from a recent snow event with salts in it and such. That'll get trapped in these BMPs, best management practices, these rain gardens. It gets trapped there and it doesn't enter our storm system, doesn't have to be mitigated at the wastewater treatment facility, and doesn't end up in our rivers and our watersheds. So kind of interesting to see these different phases. And these are all pictures from this week. So it's been great to have fresh material. These can be applied residentially as well. So on the left, you'll see the original neighborhood. On the right, you'll see the plotted out neighborhood as it ended up being in what's a pilot project in South Kansas City. This area was chosen, you'll see this dotted yellow line. This is just a little section of kind of the area of town in which it's at. that was chosen because all of the inflows in this urban neighborhood all come out in one outfall. So any rain event in this neighborhood can be measured in real time. We can have outflow measurements from this one pipe that can say, okay, well, we did green infrastructure implementation in this entire sub watershed, and it comes out of this one pipe, and we can see the impacts. And this was a really forward-thinking response to the EPA consent decree, and it was evaluated by the Kansas State University Landscape Performance Series. It's an extremely successful project, and it's one of our proudest that we maintain here in Kansas City under contract from KC Water. This site, this is one of those, let me backtrack just quickly. Each of these little green squares, rectangles and such, orange squares and rectangles, blue rectangles, those are all different types of sites. There can be bioretention with a big underground tank. There can be just a simple trench, a rain garden, or a bioswale. These can be permeable sidewalks as well. There's an example of this right here in this image. You see the Rice Krispie looking type stuff in the sidewalk. This is a neighborhood that is somewhat of an underserved community. Let's put it simply. And so there's an environmental and a social justice element to this installation as well, where new sidewalks are at play here. And not only new sidewalks, but new sidewalks that are going to keep your neighborhood from flooding during those events. This is a combined sewer area. When this street flooded because there were no gutters, no curbs, and very underserved stormwater infrastructure, guess whose basements flooded with that combined sewage? And it was this residential sort of area. So a multifaceted approach to this. We've got sidewalks that will actually allow infiltration of stormwater. Pervious concrete is what this particular example is called. You might see permeable pavers. You might see green blocks. There's a whole slew of applications that are actually hardscape green infrastructure that incorporate concrete, but it's serving the same purpose of stormwater management. Look at this garden. I mean, this is, to me, a beautiful garden. It's cute. It has curb bump outs. So these are street bump outs where they'll put the green infrastructure in it. Those bump outs are proven to reduce traffic velocities in these residential neighborhoods, slows traffic down, gets people to take a look at things that are beautiful. And it is a really beneficial implementation process for green infrastructure, at least in this site down in South Kansas City. This is what it looked like a couple weeks ago. It's one of the prettiest ones we have. That's Amsonia in full bloom, flanked by some beautiful sedges. We've got some Tradescanthia in there, excellent spiderwort. To me, this is just beautiful. It replicates a natural environment, but it is doing an incredible job of managing stormwater. In any given rain event, this collective site, which is known as Target Green East or the Marlboro Pilot Area, Middle Blue Pilot Area, in a 1-inch rain, 1.4-inch rain event, you're talking about 390,000 gallons of stormwater that are retained on site. The K-State Performance Landscape Series evaluated that overall runoff flow is reduced by anywhere between 70 and 80%. Peak flow reduced by 76%, which means when the rain first falls and it used to just go rushing into that system, causing the combined sewer overflow, is reduced by 70%. Peak flow volume by 30%. It's just the numbers are again from people much smarter than me who could explain them in more detail. But when I read the results of these studies, I'm pleased. And most importantly, when I'm looking at these gardens in place, the residents are pleased. I'm pleased. We're able to keep this place beautiful, and we know that it's working so well to its original design. Here's one in the shade area of that same neighborhood, just a rain garden, just a little ditch. You'll notice there's no curb here. They flattened the sidewalk or the street curb to allow it to be a low flush, a mowable curb. We got a little turf area to keep it looking neat. Everybody, again, going back to that, everybody loves their American lawn. It's got to look good. And these are red twig dogwood, a really cool ornamental shrub. Now, those are all municipal projects. I also did residential contracting. We'll get into that a little bit as far as what municipalities can do to encourage their residents to even take it back one more notch. What if every house in that neighborhood had a rain garden in its yard and was retaining 50% of the outfall that was going to end up in the street in the first place? This is what a very rudimentary rain garden looks like that I created for a homeowner in Olathe, Kansas. You bury your downspouts. You dig a little trench. You run it out to a low point in your yard. You plant a bunch of water-loving plants. These are a bunch of irises and sedges. We've got cardinal flower in there. We got blue lobelia up on the edges. This looks a heck of a lot better now than it did when it was planted. But something as simple as this can make a huge impact. This is on the Mill Creek watershed. Right beyond those utility easements to the left there is Mill Creek in Johnson County. And this homeowner was reimbursed $1,000 for the building of this project because of the stormwater that they were keeping on site. Here's one in Shawnee that's a little more naturalized. This is in a shady area. And so we did a lot of ground cover native plants. You see Pachyra obovata blooming right there, those yellow flowers. We've got wild ginger, we've got phlox, we've got more cardinal flower, and I opted for native sedges out on the left side of that swale. This is just a ditch that they diverted all their house rainwater into. And they received multiple grants for this project through a program that we administer. I helped to administer with a colleague of mine through Johnson County Stormwater. But it's beautiful. It's a naturalized area in a sprawling suburban property. They love it. And it's very healthy. It requires very little weeding and treats large volume of water. Lastly, the simplest thing that anybody can do is to add a rain barrel to their house. You take one downspout, you buy a 55-gallon rain barrel. This one is 3 daisy chained to each other. Again, to paraphrase statistics, if your house is 1,000 square feet, which in suburban America, I think a 1,000 square foot house is probably hard to find. So imagine multiply these by 3, by 4, and so on. We have 1,000 square foot of house in a 1-inch rain can outfall anywhere between 600 to 1,000 gallons of water, depending on the type of roof and so on and so forth. So if you have 4 downspouts and you put a 55-gallon rain barrel on each of them, all of a sudden you've just taken care of a pretty good portion of that 1-inch rain. And you can reuse that water. You wash your car with it, you wash the dog with it, you water your plants with it. It's free. Rainwater is free, and rainwater harvesting is extremely critical in stormwater management in the arid parts of our country. I speak from a very water wealthy part of our country, and I know that things are way different. You could turn this whole conversation on its head if we were having this with Environment Nevada or Environment Arizona. Bridging the Gap, a little plug here. Bridging the Gap actually will manufacture rain barrels for you. We've got a great program where you can just purchase rain barrels if you're here in the Kansas City metro area, and you can actually go to our website at bridgingthegap.org and just buy as many as 3 rain barrels up front. We'd be happy to deliver, or you can come pick up those at our recycling centers. Beyond that, I'm going to go ahead and make a little plug for our Johnson County Stormwater program. We redesigned it to be a little bit more, I'd say, marketable. So we called it Contain the Rain. And this is, again, that cost share reimbursement program through Johnson County Stormwater, where residents can implement, sort of ideas, policies, projects like this, and they can put their money forward first, and they can be reimbursed up to $1,000 in some municipalities. It just depends. But our plug is going to be for Contain the Rain. ContainTheRainJoco.com, and all information can be found there if you're a Johnson County, Kansas resident in this part of the country. And I know I'm rambling, so we should probably open up for questions.
Oh, good, Chris. That was wonderful. If you wouldn't mind, stop sharing your screen, or you can keep it up there, I guess, so everybody can remember it. We're going to go ahead and ask some questions. If you have any questions, remember to leave them in the Facebook live stream comment section or in the Q&A. I do have a question to just kind of get the ball rolling, Chris, if that's okay. Yeah, I was just curious. I mean, I sent you a video today of, all of the sediment that was coming off of my house into the, sewers basically in my neighborhood. I was curious if you No, I mean, like other than doing, because I rent my property, so other than doing like a rain garden and paying for that in a house that I don't pay for, or like how can I, do you know how I can advocate for like any type of green infrastructure in my neighborhood?
Well, we do a little bit of work with neighborhood associations, but again, typically, this is common across our country, across many countries around the world. If you don't own the property, your impacts are limited. What you can advocate for is policy at the municipal level and say, we need programs that can incentivize property owners, whether they be tenants, property management companies, in particular, advocate for developers to be held to more stringent outflow standards. You know, if you're going to be building a multi-million-dollar apartment complex, is it really that hard to incorporate some green infrastructure around the fringes in your landscaping? I would argue no, but I may be biased.
So I personally have several questions. I've been enthralled throughout this entire thing. Thank you so much. This has been great. I came to this work from an agriculture background, and so I wonder, in looking at this, I have some friends who have started organizations that turn lawns into productive vegetable gardens. But I'm thinking through, what you showed of the root systems and sort of thinking about the longevity of native plants and the fact that they stay there, and they're able to really take root. What is sort of, for people who are, like Bridget said, are thinking through trashing their lawns and trying to make it something better, is it best to have the native plants, or is there a place for vegetables in all of this? It sounds like you've chosen things really strategically. Can you just say more about that?
Yeah, again, these are, really vast engineered systems that I'm working with as far as from the maintenance angle. When it comes down to you with your own hands, and I've got a little plug for our Grow Native organization, this Missouri Prairie Foundation's Grow Native. So many resources about how to incorporate native plants into vegetable production as well. There's so many partner species that are absolutely ideal that will draw in native bees to help pollinate your tomatoes, your squashes, your eggplants, your cucumbers, and so on. And a combination of those two is not only easy and natural, but it's common sense. Like it's a complementary agrarian system. And if you want to take that from the residential level and extrapolate it out to big ag, something as simple as prairie strips in between row crop fields can provide benefits beyond metrics that I would be able to comprehend, as far as pollutant uptake in a simple native prairie strip alongside a conventional soybean field, or even going so far as to do that hybrid type of approach with produce and native plants, to where you have that stormwater management benefit that has a co-benefit of pollinator preservation and most importantly, let's be honest, tomato production.
So if other folks have questions, put them in the chat. But in the meantime, I have more questions. I know a little, you mentioned the ditch that the homeowner had and that they'd gotten funding to do that. Can you say anything about, I'm thinking through sort of urban planning and city planning. Do you have advice for, when we're advocating and things like this, are there ways that our cities could be built better, not only in incorporating these, these vital gardens, but as far as trying to think through contour or well-placed swales or things like ditches? Like, is there a way that we could help kind of mitigate in that way through better planning, or is it just where we've done damage?
That's a really good question, Kate. I guess I can't speak too much. I work within some of these municipalities, but I don't have a lot of experience from that top down, from the blank slate saying, okay, this is how we're going to build this neighborhood. What I do know, though, is that it's all possible, and that especially in this region, we have some wonderful people working towards, again, that complete streets model, which incorporates transportation. So you saw there, we have multimodal transportation. We're addressing as many environmental issues as we can with one paintbrush. So we're addressing transportation, trying to reduce emissions through incorporating pedestrian and cycling. We're also at the same time trying to treat the stormwater We're trying to make these corridors more livable and trying to bring the population into a sustainable urban environment. I think I speak more from the ground up level of understanding, but I know that there are so many brilliant people at the top levels that are working to figure out how to best take all of these things into the boardroom and make sure that we come up with the best results.
Awesome. And this is, here's a question just now. So the question is, you mentioned working in Johnson County. Have you worked with the Lenexa, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, City Center? I recently walked their rainwater trail, which highlights native plants and how to sequester water before it enters the river. Cool.
Lenexa is one of my favorite examples of a municipality that has been forward thinking, at least in this area. Several of my clients have as a private contractor, of course, before I was contracted with Kansas City, Missouri. Several of my clients worked within their cost share program. Not to name names, but their admins that work through that stormwater, they're doing a great job in Lenexa, Kansas. Let's just say they're doing tremendous. If you drive even down 87th Street, you drive down Prairie Star Parkway, even their transportation corridors are beautiful. They're prairie restorations, and they're really doing an exemplary job as far as in the Kansas City metro area. And yeah, to that question asker, be grateful. You're in a good spot.
And it sounds like that is very replicable. Like it sounds, what I'm taking from this is so much inspiration that you all, you have this plan, like you said, you have these engineered systems, you have Lenexa, like we're looking at how to do it, right? So it sounds like the future is limitless in this. Is that fair to say?
I would hope so. As we discussed, the rain events will only get more difficult to manage. Every time we re-engineer a new infrastructure system to tolerate our next 100-year storm, that new 100-year storm arrives in like 5 years, and we're like, oh, whoops, re-engineer, like figure it out. So it keeps breaking our understandings of what needs to be managed using that conventional model of gray infrastructure. And so, at least in this area, we have the capacity to restore native ecosystems to their original stormwater management potential, not to their original eco potential. But we live in the prairie. We tore it up to build our street. We can put it back to prairie, and those plants are going to thrive, and they're going to do their job one more time.
Awesome. Well, this has been amazing. The final question we generally ask all of our guests, for all of the people who are on here, what is one piece of advice, one thing that we can all go do right now to make a difference in this world, in this area? Like, what is the thing we can do that can help support the amazing work that you're doing?
Well, first of all, again, in this crisis, volunteerism has kind of been nipped in the bud, and that's really something that we're working to overcome. Bridging the Gap is fueled by volunteers, and our work is just critical to the environment of this area. So once we are able to begin remanaging those social settings where we're able to get out in nature and volunteer, that's really it. Your time, everybody knows, is far more valuable than something as simple as writing a check. But in times like these, you should go ahead and write a check.
Awesome. We actually just got one more question, and then I promise we'll let you go. The question is, in Northeast Kansas, how effective is buffalo grass as a turf grass?
Really effective, actually. Buffalo grass is difficult to start from seed, extremely challenging for a seed project. So if you've got a large area, it requires maybe some deep pockets or maybe some patience. Installing plug grasses, installing native plugs of buffalo grass, typically is very effective in this region. I love buffalo grass.
And we have one more question. People are getting into it now. The question is, I live in South Florida and have regular flooding, standing water on one side of the house. That side is mostly just dirt plus square stone walkway steps. in watching your presentation, I wonder whether something like the special sidewalk you showed would help prevent standing water and runoff.
It's very possible. In particular, you got to think about in Florida, a lot of South Florida is probably built on rocky, really dense geologic soil. Not much soil to speak of, rather. And so I would definitely look into some engineered solutions about infiltration. So getting that water through the dirt that may have been put on by the people who built the house in the first place, and incorporating perhaps a hybrid system, like we talked about, maybe green blocks, maybe laying in those grid infiltration sidewalk systems that have little plugs of, say, some native. I'm not really sure what grasses are native in South Florida, but every region has beautiful native plants that will thrive in the weather and climate that is there. And yeah, those little urban, suburban sides of your house where you can't get grass to grow, that is a universal problem all the way across the board. Doesn't matter what city you're in.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Chris. We appreciate it. As a reminder to everybody, check out Bridging the Gap social media, their website. Donate if you can to them, to Environment Missouri, Environment Maryland. It's true of now is such a difficult time where that is such a huge thing we're all needing. Chris, huge thank you to you. Bridget, is there anything else you want to add before we wrap up?
Thank you as well. Thank you, Chris. Thank you, Kate. Thank you, everybody, for joining. This was wonderful.
Guys, happy
Thanks, everybody.
Have a good night, everyone.